90 sheep, $17 a head, $1,530 total. That was every cent Nora Cobb had left in the world, and she was about to hand it to an auctioneer while a room full of men laughed at her. She did not look at the men. She looked at the sheep. They stood pressed against the back rail of the Sullivan County Livestock Yard in a loose, miserable cluster, the way animals stand when they have been moved too many times in too few days. Their wool came in patches. Their ribs showed through in places. Two of them walked with a slight drag on the left foreleg that the auctioneer had already noted aloud, twice, in a tone designed to discourage serious interest. One small ewe near the gate had her eyes half closed and her head resting against the rail as though she had decided, somewhere between the last farm and this one, that the proceedings no longer concerned her. The catalog called them a discount lot of unimproved Tunis crosses from a foreclosed operation in the next county over. The men at the rail called them something less generous. Wade Renfro was the one who said it loudest. He owned 600 acres of bottomland on the east side of Harlan Ridge and considered himself the unofficial judge of every transaction that passed through the yard. He was a big man with a red neck and a good coat and the particular confidence of someone who had been right about livestock for 30 years and had never been given a reason to question the habit. He stood with two other men near the coffee urn, and when the lot came up and Nora raised her paddle, he turned to the man beside him and said, loud enough to carry across the room, that Agricor had just offered that girl $280,000 for her land, and she was standing here buying dead sheep. The man beside him laughed. The auctioneer, who knew the Cobb name and therefore knew whose granddaughter was holding that paddle, brought the gavel down at $17 a head without quite meeting her eye. Nora paid in cash from a folded envelope, signed for the lot, and walked out to the loading chute without speaking to anyone. She was 22 years old. She had driven 3 hours that morning from a town where she had been finishing the second year of an agricultural trades program, working 4 nights a week at a highway diner, sharing a rented room with a woman she did not know well and did not need to know better, when the call came from a neighbor saying Della Cobb had fallen a second time and the cousins had run out of days. Nora packed her car in an afternoon and did not call the diner to say she was not coming back. That had been 6 weeks ago. The farm, when she pulled up the gravel drive for the first time in 4 years, looked the way neglected things look when you return to them as an adult, which is smaller and larger at the same time. The house was a 2-story frame building with a tin roof her grandfather Emmett had put on himself in 1974, working alone over 3 weekends in October because he did not trust anyone else to get the pitch right. The barn leaned south at an angle it had maintained for as long as anyone could remember. There were 68 acres altogether, most of it sloped pasture gone to broom sedge and cedar saplings, a creek running along the western fence line, and a stand of hardwood at the back that Emmett had refused to log even when the timber money would have solved 3 separate problems at once. Della was sitting on the porch when Nora arrived. She did not stand. She did not wave. She watched the car come up the drive with the particular stillness of a woman who has been waiting for something and is not going to pretend otherwise. When Nora came up the steps, her grandmother looked at her for a long moment and said, "You came." Nora said she had. Della said, "Sit down then," and the two of them sat in the cold April air and watched a red-tailed hawk work the field below the house until the hawk found what it was looking for and dropped, and the field went quiet. Then Della said, "Your grandfather kept a ledger. I will tell you where it is when you are ready." Nora said she was ready now. Della said, "No, you are not. You have not walked the fence line yet." So, Nora walked the fence line. She walked it the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, coming back each time with a report that Della received without comment, nodding once and going back to whatever she was doing with her hands, which was usually mending something that did not strictly need to be mended. The fence itself needed a great deal of mending, and Nora did that too, buying wire and staples at the hardware store in town and working the posts with a maul she found in the barn, learning the ground one panel at a time. What she noticed on those walks, she wrote in a small spiral notebook she had bought at the gas station on her second day home. She noticed the creek ran clear and steady even in the dry weeks of late April, unusual for a creek that size on a ridge that high. She noticed the hardwood stand at the back held a coolness and a damp beneath it that the surrounding slopes did not, and the leaf litter there was black and deep in a way that suggested water moving slowly through the ground beneath it. She noticed a quarter-acre patch in the lower pasture where the grass came in greener and earlier than everything around it, and where, when she pressed her boot into the soil, the ground gave slightly more than it should have. She wrote all of this down, not because she had a plan for the notes, because making them felt like the right thing to do. The bank letter and Harlan Cross arrived in the same week, 3 days apart, and Nora would later understand that this was not a coincidence. The letter came on a Monday from Sullivan County Savings and Loan, stating in the careful language of institutions that the Cobb property carried an outstanding balance of $54,000 against a note due on the 15th of November. The property had been in arrears for 8 months. The bank was prepared to discuss restructuring options, which was the bank's way of saying they were also prepared to foreclose and were extending the courtesy of a warning before they did. Harlan Cross knocked on the door on Thursday. He was 44 years old, lean and well-dressed, with the kind of grooming that takes effort to make look effortless. He carried a card from Agricor Agricultural Systems, Regional Director for Appalachian Operations, and held it out with both hands. He was, on that first visit, entirely reasonable. Agricor had been investing in sustainable agriculture infrastructure across the Tennessee Ridge system for 6 years, he said. The Harlan Ridge project would bring broadband connectivity to the county, create 40 permanent jobs, fund a new wing at the elementary school in Blountville. The offer of $280,000 was a fair market valuation conducted by an independent appraiser. He said, "Take your time, Miss Cobb. You have until October." He smiled when he said it. The smile reached far enough. But he looked at the house when he said it, not at her. And the look was the calculation of a man estimating how long a structure has before it becomes a liability. After he left, Nora stood on the porch and watched the SUV move down the gravel drive and turn onto the county road. Della appeared behind her and said, "Was that Agricor?" Nora said yes. Della said, "Your grandfather said they would send someone polite first." Nora did not know yet that Agricor had pulled the Sullivan County property tax records the previous February, or that the arrears notice from the bank had been part of what they were watching for. $54,000. She had $612 in a checking account in Knoxville, a car with 140,000 miles and a cracked dashboard, 68 acres of sloped pasture in the Appalachian ridgeline, and a grandmother who had not asked for help and was not going to start now. She had a ledger. The ledger was in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the back room, under a folded quilt and a stack of Farm Bureau magazines from the 1980s. Emmett Cobb was stamped in faded gold on the cover, with the year 1961 pressed below it in smaller letters. Nora carried it to the kitchen table and opened it and sat there for 2 hours without moving. It was not what she had expected. She had imagined a farm journal of some kind, the sort of record a man might keep for planting dates and rainfall totals. What she found was something stranger and more deliberate. The first 30 pages were a hand-drawn map of the 68 acres, done in pencil and ink over what must have been years, with elevations marked in her grandfather's careful hand and small notations beside dozens of points across the property. The notations said things like seep active March through June, and clay shelf 18 inches down, and old well-capped 1941 never failed. There were arrows showing the direction of subsurface water movement as Emmett had understood it. There were small numbered circles keyed to longer entries at the back of the book, where he had written paragraphs about each location in prose that was plain and unhurried and completely free of speculation. The hardwood stand had 11 numbered circles. The quarter-acre green patch in the lower pasture had 3. The creek had notations running its entire length, including a stretch of about 50 yards above the western fence where her grandfather had written in slightly larger letters than the rest, "Water comes up here from below. Do not disturb until needed." Nora turned to the inside back cover and found something that stopped her cold. The main entries were in blue ink, the hand of a younger man, careful and deliberate, but on the inside back cover, in darker ink and with a heavier pressure, her grandfather had added something that was not part of the original ledger. The handwriting was older, the letters larger and less even. It read they came in 1987 under a different name, Blackfield Agricultural Partners. They wanted the Ridgewater, and they left when they found the 1962 certificate. Agricor is the same company. They will come again. The water will stop them again. Nora read that paragraph 4 times. Then she closed the ledger and sat at the kitchen table without moving. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway and looked at her face and said, "So you found the back cover?" Nora said she had. Della walked to the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Nora and sat across from her. Emmett had added those lines in 1991, Della said, after Blackfield left. He had gone back through his papers and confirmed that Agricor was the parent company, operating under different names in 3 states. He had told her they would return inside of 20 years and said he was probably underestimating them. Nora said, "What is the 1962 certificate?" Della set her coffee cup down. It was a water priority rights document issued by the state of Tennessee. She said Emmett had applied for it in 1961 when a paper mill upstream was threatening to redirect a tributary. The state granted it in March of 1962, giving the Cobb property first claim on the subsurface water under all 68 acres. Emmett had kept it in the ledger because he did not trust filing cabinets and did not trust banks, and believed a document kept in a cedar chest inside a locked house was safer than anything stored where other people had keys. Nora said, "Where is it now?" Della said, "Turn to page 23. Nora opened the ledger to entry 23 and turned the page over. Pressed to the back of it, sealed flat with a strip of beeswax along each edge, was a folded piece of paper. She worked the wax loose carefully and unfolded it on the table. It was a single page on official state letterhead, dated March 14, 1962, signed by the director of the Tennessee Division of Water Resources. It certified Emmett Cobb as the holder of Water Priority Rights Certificate Number 7 for the subsurface water underlying the described parcel in Sullivan County. The description matched the 68 acres exactly. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Della picked up her coffee and said, "He used to say the ridge was holding water the way a sponge holds a spill. He said one day someone would figure out how to use it. He said whoever read the ledger would know what to do." Then she said, "Eat your breakfast." And that was the end of the conversation. It was not the end of the problem. Nora spent the last 2 weeks of April reading the ledger, every entry twice, the map 3 times. She cross-referenced the notations against the topography she had walked, checking her notebook observations against her grandfather's. The green patch in the lower pasture appeared in entry 23, the one with the certificate behind it, and the entry described a perched aquifer sitting on a clay shelf, recharged by lateral flow from the ridge above, estimated to yield a small but consistent spring if properly opened. Below the main entry, in the same darker ink as the back cover notes, Emmett had added, "Do not open until you have a use for it." She read the well records at the county clerk's office on a Tuesday, spending 4 hours going through the bound volumes. Of the 11 wells drilled within a 2-mile radius of the Cobb property over the past 30 years, 9 had struck water at depths between 58 and 84 feet. The 2 that had not hit water had been drilled on the far side of a geological fault running along the county road, which her grandfather had marked in the ledger with an arrow and the words "Stops here." She drove home with the photocopies on the seat beside her, knowing 2 things with the certainty that comes from evidence rather than hope. The water was there, and Agricor almost certainly knew it was there too, which meant $280,000 was not a fair valuation. It was an offer calculated to close before she discovered what the land was actually worth. She could not prove the second thing yet. She did not need to. What she needed immediately was money, not the 280,000 kind, the kind that came in small amounts from work done with your hands on ground you were beginning to know. She thought about the sheep because of something Della had mentioned in passing, weeks earlier, when Nora had asked why the back pasture had been let go. Cattle were too heavy for that ground, Della had said. Emmett had always meant to run sheep on it, but never gotten around to it. Sheep were light on the land. They would graze the broom sedge and the cedar saplings without compacting the soil. They would, if the ledger was right about the seeps and the springs, find their own water in places a cattle herd could not reach. And sheep, more to the point, were cheap to get into if you bought the kind that no one else wanted. She drove to the Sullivan County Livestock Yard on a Thursday to look at what was available. The yard manager, Pete Gallagher, a quiet man who processed transactions without editorializing, showed her the upcoming lots. There was a discount offering of 90 Tunis crosses from a foreclosed farm in Hawkins County. 4 days in transit. The catalog noted the condition honestly and priced them accordingly. She went back Saturday morning with the envelope. She had been saving the money for 2 years, not for sheep, not for anything specific, just saving it in the way a person saves who knows that the day will come when they need it all at once. The envelope held $1,530, everything she had except the checking account, and the checking account would not survive another month of groceries. She stood at the back rail and looked at the 90 sheep and saw what her grandfather's ledger had taught her to see. Not 90 sick animals. 90 animals that would walk that particular ground gently and ask very little of it in return. And that the ground, if the ledger was correct, would give back more than it was asked. She raised her paddle when the lot came up. She held it there while Wade Renfro made his comment about dead sheep and the men around him laughed. She kept it there until the gavel came down. On the drive home, with 2 borrowed stock trailers following behind her, Nora did not think about the men at the rail. She thought about entry 23 and the clay shelf and the perched aquifer and the word her grandfather had underlined at the end of the last note he ever wrote about it, which was the word needed. The sheep came off the trailers in the late afternoon, filing through the gate to the lower pasture in a loose, uncertain line. They spread across the field slowly, moving the way animals move when they are not yet sure the ground beneath them is safe. The small ewe who had been leaning against the rail at the auction walked about 20 yards from the gate and sat down in the grass and did not get up. Caleb Briggs, who was 17 and had driven the second trailer for $40 and a sandwich, stood at the fence watching her. He said that one is not going to make it. Nora looked at the ewe for a moment and said, "We will see." Della was on the porch when Nora came up the hill. She had a blanket across her knees and watched the sheep moving across the lower pasture without speaking for a long time. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have counted them before the trailer stopped." Nora said she had already counted them. Della said how many. Nora said 89 on their feet and one sitting down by the east fence that Caleb thinks will not survive the week. Della looked at the sitting ewe for a moment. Then she said, "Watch that one." Not as an observation, as an instruction. The 2 of them sat on the porch as the light went down behind the ridge and the pasture went from green to blue to black. Somewhere in the dark of the hardwood stand, a coyote called once and was not answered. That was the first night the Cobb place had carried livestock in 11 years. What Nora did not know that evening, watching the darkness settle over the lower pasture, was that 4 miles away in the county seat, Harlan Cross was sitting in a rented office above the hardware store on Main Street, reviewing a report from Agricorp's geological consulting firm. The report had been commissioned 6 months earlier, before the first offer was ever made, and it described in technical language what Emmett Cobb had described in plain language in a hand-drawn ledger 60 years before. The ridge above Sullivan County held a significant subsurface water reserve, rechargeable at a rate that made it effectively permanent. The firm estimated its commercial value for agricultural irrigation purposes at between $3 and $6 million, depending on extraction rights. Agricorp's offer of $280,000 had not been a fair market valuation. It had been a calculation. Harlan Cross was not a cruel man in the way people imagine cruel men. He was a practical one. He had been sent to Sullivan County to close a land package 3 years in assembly, and the Cobb parcel was the last piece. He had 60 days before the company's investment window closed and the financing restructured in a way that would end his involvement in the project. He had assumed, based on the bank's records and the condition of the property, that the girl would take the money. He had not assumed she would go to the livestock yard and buy 90 sheep. He set the report in his briefcase and closed it and told himself it did not matter. She had a debt and a deadline and no resources. The sheep were a gesture, not a strategy. He had seen gestures before. They did not hold against math. He was not wrong about the math. He was wrong about the gesture. By the time he understood that, the ewe Caleb had written off as a lost cause had been on her feet for 6 weeks, had put on weight steadily, and had taken to coming to the gate every morning when Nora arrived with the salt block. Nora had not named her. She held that line for almost 3 weeks. She almost held it. The name she settled on, without quite deciding to, was Lean. When Della noticed her using it one morning, her grandmother said nothing, which was the closest thing to approval the Cobb women had ever managed on the subject of names, and Nora understood it perfectly. The first month was harder than she had expected and easier than she had feared. 3 of the 90 died in the first 10 days, which Doyle Briggs said was within the range you had to accept on a distressed lot. Doyle was 62, thin through the shoulders, and worked with the particular economy of motion that comes from spending a lifetime doing physical things efficiently. He walked the pasture with Nora for 2 hours, asked questions, answered questions, and did not waste language on either. The remaining animals were sounder than the catalog had suggested. He said the wool, while coarser than fine-grade merino, had a length and crimp to it that certain buyers valued, and she should not let the buyer in town tell her it was worth nothing because it was not. He gave her the name of Cora Sutton in Greenville, who ran a family weaving operation and bought directly from small producers, and wrote the name on the back of a feed receipt with the stub of a pencil he kept behind his left ear. He did not take coffee when she offered it. He got in his truck and drove back to Hawkins County. His son Caleb, who had come along in the passenger seat, stayed to help with the afternoon work and stayed again the next day and the day after that, because he had, without quite noticing, become interested in what was happening in the lower pasture. Nora called Cora Sutton that evening. Cora asked questions for 20 minutes, the kind that tell you the person asking them knows the subject. At the end of the 20 minutes, she said she would take the full clip at $4.15 a pound, sight unseen on Doyle's word, and that she would come up the following Saturday with cash. Nora hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went out to the porch and told Della that the wool had sold before it was even off the sheep. Della did not look up from her sewing. She said, "Well." Then she said, "That is a beginning. Flat and certain." The tone of someone stating a fact they have no intention of debating. Nora carried those 4 words down to the pasture and back up to the house and to bed that night, and she was still carrying them in the morning, which was exactly how her grandmother had intended it. The talk started at the Henley Feed and Supply in the second week of May. Wade Renfro came in on Wednesdays more for the company than the supplies, and he was the one who started it, though he would later claim he had only been repeating what others were already saying. What others were saying, according to Wade, was that the Cobb girl had spent her last dollar on 90 doomed animals and was somehow not losing money on them, which he attributed to beginner's luck, the wet spring, and the fact that she had not yet seen a real winter, or a real predator loss, or a real veterinary bill. He predicted, with the confidence of a man whose forecasts had always corrected themselves toward his original position, that things would settle into their proper order by the time the leaves turned. The men at the feed store listened the way they always listened. With agreement that requires no commitment, the conversation moved on. But something had shifted almost imperceptibly in the way the Cobb place was discussed, and those who drove past it on the county road had begun, without acknowledging it to themselves, to slow down a little as they went by. Harlan Cross drove past it too, on his way back to the rented office, on a Thursday afternoon in late May. He slowed on the county road and looked at the lower pasture through the window. The broom sedge was gone. The pasture looked like a pasture. A great white dog moved slowly along the fence line, nose down, and the sheep spread evenly across the field in the way healthy animals spread when the forage is good and they are not afraid. He drove on without stopping. He told himself it still did not matter. She had $54,000 in debt and no mechanism to pay it. The timeline would resolve itself. He was right about the timeline. He was wrong about the resolution. 4 miles up the ridge, Nora Cobb sat at the kitchen table with her grandfather's ledger open and her notebook beside it, cross-referencing the notations about entry 23 against the well records she had photocopied at the county clerk's office. The number that kept appearing, in record after record, was 71 feet. She underlined it once. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. Outside, the lower pasture was dark, and the creek was running, and the ridge held the night the way it held everything, without giving any of it back. June came in warm and dry, and with it came the first shearing. Doyle drove up on a Monday with his equipment in the back of his truck and Caleb in the passenger seat, and worked through the flock over 2 days with the focused efficiency of a man who has done this particular work so many times that it has become something closer to craft than labor. He moved from animal to animal without rushing and without wasted motion, and the wool came off in long, even rolls that Caleb stacked against the barn wall in the order Doyle specified. When it was done, Doyle stood at the barn door and looked at the pile. "Not bad wool," he said, plainly, without decoration. The length was good, and the crimp was consistent, and Cora Sutton would not be disappointed. Cora came up on Saturday in a white pickup truck with a stock rack and a small trailer. She was 55, broad-shouldered, with gray in her hair and the kind of hands that told you she had worked with fiber her entire adult life. She walked through the wool pile slowly, pulling sections open, checking the staple length with the same deliberate attention Doyle had given the animals themselves. She did not hurry the inspection, and she did not make conversation while she was doing it. When she finished, she said $4.20 a pound, a statement, not an offer. She had a scale in the trailer, and they weighed the clip together, and the number she wrote on the check was larger than the number Nora had calculated in her head because the clip was heavier than she had estimated. Cora tore the check from the book, held it out, and said, "Tell Doyle I said the animals are better than he let on." Nora said she would. Cora loaded the wool and drove back down the gravel drive, and Nora stood in the barn with the check and looked at it for a long moment. It was not enough to pay the bank debt. It was not close to enough, but it was real money from real work, more than the sheep had cost, and those two facts together meant something she did not try to put into words. She put the check in the kitchen drawer with the photocopies and the ledger and the 1962 certificate, and went back out to the pasture. The first ewe sale happened the way most useful things happened at the Cobb place, which was without planning and at someone else's initiative. A woman named Ruth Gallagher, married to Pete from the livestock yard, drove up the gravel road on a Saturday in early July and asked at the gate whether Nora had any ewes available. Nora said the flock had not been bred yet. Ruth said she understood and that she was looking for breeding stock, not lambs. Tunis crosses were nearly impossible to find in the county, and she had been trying to start a small flock for 2 years. Nora looked at the pasture for a moment. She had been thinking about which animals to keep and which to turn over, had made preliminary marks in her notebook, but had not committed to any of them. She said, "How many are you looking for?" Ruth said 4 if possible, and that she preferred ewes that had already shown some resilience. They settled on $70 a head, 4 times the auction price. Ruth wrote a check and came back with a trailer the following Saturday. She chose 4 animals herself, walking slowly through the flock with the eye of someone who knew what she was looking at. The last one she chose was a ewe with a slight drag in her left foreleg that Nora had been watching for 2 months. Ruth said that one has good bone structure. The limp is old, not progressive. You can see it in how she compensates. The ones that figure out how to compensate are usually the ones worth keeping. She loaded the 4 ewes and drove down the drive, and Nora wrote the transaction in her notebook and underlined the price and then underlined what Ruth had said about compensation, because it seemed like a thing worth remembering. By August, she had sold 11 ewes through the same informal channels, all at prices between $65 and $85, all to small operators who had heard about the flock through Ruth or Cora or Doyle, none of whom Nora had asked to say anything. The money from the wool and the ewe sales combined had now exceeded the original cost of the flock by a factor of nearly 2. She still had 78 sheep in the pasture, all of them heavier and healthier than they had been in May, and a ram that Doyle had located at a sale in Claiborne County and hauled up in his truck in exchange for a promise Nora had made with a handshake and intended to keep. News of the ewe sales reached the feed store in the 3rd week of August. Wade heard it from Pete Gallagher, who mentioned it without emphasis, the way a man mentions weather. Wade said she had gotten lucky on the ewes, his tone carrying the particular register of a man adjusting a forecast he has no intention of publicly revising. The men at the counter agreed that luck was probably involved, and the conversation moved on, but it moved on more slowly than it would have in May. And 2 of the men who had been at the rail when Nora raised her paddle drove past the Cobb place that week, and both slowed on the county road, though neither stopped. Harlan Cross was not slowing down. He was driving faster by August. The way men drive when a deadline has become a pressure rather than a plan. He had submitted the survey application to the county commission in the 2nd week of July, requesting authorization for what the application called a mandatory geological assessment of the Harlan Ridge Corridor under the 1974 Natural Resource Development Act. 40 pages of language designed to be technically accurate and practically unreadable. It had passed through the commission without significant discussion because 3 of the 5 commissioners had been briefed by AgriCorps' regional liaison the previous spring. The authorization came through on the 1st of August. It gave AgriCorps 60 days to conduct surface and subsurface surveys across the Ridge Corridor, including portions of privately held land where the survey was deemed necessary for the public interest assessment. It included the Cobb parcel by description. Harlan drove up the gravel road on a Tuesday morning in the 1st week of August with the authorization paperwork and a 2nd man from the company's legal office. He knocked on the door with the same precise knock as before. Della answered. She looked at him, then at the folder, then at him again. She said, "My granddaughter is in the pasture." She did not move from the doorway. Harlan said he would wait. Della said, "You can wait on the porch." She closed the door. Nora came up from the lower pasture 10 minutes later, wiping her hands on a cloth she kept tucked in her belt. She looked at Harlan, then at the man beside him, then at the folder. She said, "What is this?" Harlan explained the survey authorization with the same careful reasonableness he had used on his first visit. Non-invasive equipment, county review, public interest, advance notice as a courtesy. Nora took the folder and read the authorization document on the porch without sitting down. She read it slowly and twice. She signed the acknowledgement of receipt, handed the folder back, and said, "When will the team arrive?" Harlan said 3 weeks, approximately. Nora said, "All right." He had expected something, a question, an objection, the particular distress of someone realizing the walls are closer than they thought. He got nothing except a woman standing on a porch holding a cloth, looking at him with an expression that gave him nothing to work with. He said, "The offer remains open until October. Miss Cobb, Nora said. I know. He drove away. Della appeared in the doorway after the SUV turned onto the county road. She said, "What did they want?" Nora told her about the survey authorization. Della was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather said they would find a way to look at the ground before they made a final move. She said, he wrote it in the ledger somewhere toward the back. He said it was the one thing he was not sure they could stop. Nora went inside and found the passage near the end of the operational notes, in the same dark ink as the back cover editions. Her grandfather had written, if they get authorization to survey, do not let them survey first. The certificate establishes the right. The well establishes the fact. They cannot argue a fact they cannot disprove. She closed the ledger and called Bud Meeker. She had the name from Doyle, who had given it to her in May with the matter-of-fact recommendation of someone passing along a tool they trust. Bud Meeker had been drilling wells in the Sullivan County area for 34 years. Doyle said he was the only man worth calling for anything involving ridge geology because he had drilled more holes in that particular ground than anyone else and knew its moods. Bud came out on a Thursday. He was 57, heavy-set, with forearms built for a purpose and a face that showed he had been outside in all weather for a very long time. He walked the property with Nora for 2 hours, and she showed him the ledger, which he studied with the attention of someone who has learned not to dismiss homemade maps. He asked her 3 times to show him the green patch in the lower pasture, approaching it from different angles, pressing the soil with the heel of his boot, crouching once to pull a handful of grass and examine the root depth. He walked the creek above the western fence and stood at the stretch where her grandfather had written about the upwelling, bent down, and put his hand in the water and held it there for a long time without speaking. When he stood up, he said, "Your grandfather knew his ground. He could drill a test well in the lower pasture for $1,400, he said. He would know within a day whether there was water and within a week how much." Nora wrote him a check from the wool and ewe money. She had $300 left in the account after she wrote it, and the shearing fee to Doyle was still outstanding. And she did not tell Della any of this. She shook Bud's hand and he drove back down the gravel road, and she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall for a while. Della came in from the back room and said, "What did the driller say?" Nora told her. Della said, "When is he coming?" Nora said 2 weeks, around the same time as the AgriCorps survey team. Della said, "Good." Nora said it was going to be close. Della said, "Your grandfather never cared about close. He cared about first." She went back to the back room, and Nora sat at the table a little longer and then went out to feed the sheep. Caleb had asked her twice in the week before the drilling what time she needed to leave for anything related to the well. She had told him she was handling it herself. He had not argued. He had simply stopped asking, which was, she was beginning to understand, its own kind of answer. What happened in the 3rd week of September happened on 2 different parts of the ridge at the same time, and the 2 events were connected in ways that neither party fully understood until later. AgriCorps' survey team arrived on a Monday morning in 2 white vans and a flatbed truck carrying equipment that Pete Gallagher described at the feed store as looking like something out of a science program. The primary instrument was a ground-penetrating radar system that the team's lead technician described. In a conversation Caleb overheard at the fuel station, as capable of imaging subsurface geology to a depth of 300 feet with a resolution of 18 inches. The system had cost approximately $2 million. The team spent the first day on the ridge above the Cobb property, working the open ground AgriCorps controlled through the purchase from Wade Renfro. They moved methodically, the radar unit running in parallel lines across the slope, 2 operators in orange vests guiding it while a 3rd monitored the imaging laptop in the van. Harlan Cross stood at the edge of the surveyed area in his field jacket, watching. The results from the first day were inconclusive. The lead technician explained that the limestone and basalt formation underlying the Harlan Ridge corridor was creating significant signal interference. The radar was bouncing off the rock layers in ways that made subsurface imaging difficult to interpret. A known challenge in Appalachian geology, he said. They would need additional passes and possibly a different instrument configuration. Harlan said, "How long?" The technician said, "3 more days minimum." On Tuesday, the team moved to the edge of the Cobb parcel, working the area along the fence line that the authorization permitted. Nora watched them from the upper pasture, not approaching, not speaking to any of them. Caleb stood with her for part of the morning. He said, "What are they looking for?" She said, "The same thing my grandfather found 60 years ago." Caleb said, "Are they going to find it?" She said, "Not if Bud gets here first." Bud Meeker arrived Wednesday morning at 6:30 with his drilling rig on a trailer. Caleb had slept in the barn the night before at Nora's request and came out rubbing his eyes when the headlights came down the gravel drive. Della was already on the porch in her coat with a cup of coffee she did not offer to share. Bud unhitched the rig in the lower pasture and set it up over the green patch with the efficiency of a man who has positioned this equipment hundreds of times and knows before he starts where everything needs to be. He checked the rig alignment twice against the notes Nora had given him from the ledger and moved the setup 4 feet to the east without explanation. Then he said, "All right," and started the engine. The sound of the drill carried up the ridge. The AgriCorps survey team, a quarter-mile away along the fence line, heard it. The lead technician looked toward the sound and then looked at his imaging monitor and then looked at Harlan Cross. Harlan Cross took out his phone. The drill went through the topsoil in the first hour. It went through the clay shelf her grandfather had noted at 18 inches in 20 minutes. It went through a band of compressed shale that Bud had not mentioned but had apparently expected, because he did not stop or adjust when it came. He kept his eyes on the drill stem and the rate of penetration and made small adjustments with the practiced attention of someone listening to something most people cannot hear. At 63 feet, the rate of penetration changed. Bud noticed it before the instruments registered it. He held up one hand, and Caleb, who had been handing him tools all morning without being asked twice, went still. Bud watched the stem for a moment and then nodded to himself and said, "There is something moving down there." At 69 feet, the bit entered fractured limestone. The water came up this casing not gradually but all at once, with a pressure that pushed the mud out of the annulus and soaked the ground around the wellhead in a circle 6 feet across. It was cold and clear, and it did not stop. Bud Meeker had drilled wells in Sullivan County for 34 years. He had hit 3 aquifers he considered exceptional in that time and had told the story of each one to his son and to Doyle Briggs and to 2 other men he respected, because those were the only stories that seemed worth telling twice. He took his cap off and stood looking at the water coming up around the casing and did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then he said, "Your grandfather was off by 2 feet." Then he said, "Everything else was exact." Della had come down from the porch and stood at the edge of the lower pasture in her coat. She said nothing. She looked at the water on the ground, then at the hardwood stand at the back of the property, then at the sky. Her face did not change, but she stood there for a long time before she turned and walked back up to the house. And it was the most visible emotion Nora had ever seen from her. Nora stood at the wellhead and let the water run over her hand. It was cold in the way that deep water is cold, a temperature that has nothing to do with the season above ground. She thought about the sentence in the ledger. She thought about the word needed. The AgriCorps imaging data from Wednesday afternoon showed a large and coherent anomaly in the subsurface profile directly beneath the Cobb lower pasture, at a depth consistent with a significant water-bearing formation. The lead technician sent the report to the Nashville office by secure file transfer at 4 in the afternoon. Harlan Cross received a call from the regional vice president at 4:30. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, Harlan sat in his rental car at the edge of the county road and looked up at the ridge and thought about his options with the focus of a man who has fewer of them than he had that morning. The survey authorization did not give Agricor rights to the water. It gave them the right to document what was there. What was there was what they had hoped for and planned for, sitting 69 feet below ground on a piece of property held by a 22-year-old woman who had bought 96 sheep with her last dollar, and who had, by drilling that well, converted a geological theory into a documented fact that any court in the state would recognize. He called the company's legal office in Nashville and said, "I need you to find out everything there is to know about water rights on the Sullivan County Ridge going back to 1940. The legal office called him back in the morning. There was a water priority rights certificate on file with the state, number 7, issued March 14, 1962, to an Emmett Cobb for the subsurface water underlying 68 acres in Sullivan County. It predated every subsequent water rights claim on the ridge by at least a decade. It had never been transferred, never been liened, and never been challenged. In their considered legal opinion, it was airtight. Harlan did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Who filed the application?" "The landowner himself," they said, "without legal representation, using a standard state form. The application was correct in every particular and had been approved without condition." He thanked them and ended the call and sat in the rented office above the hardware store and thought about a man who had filled out a state form in 1961 with a pencil, sealed the approved certificate behind beeswax in a leather ledger, and written in the margin, "Do not open until needed." He thought about 60 days and how many of them he had left. Then he called the company's litigation department and asked for a temporary restraining order on the use of the well, filed under the 1974 Act, to be in front of a judge before the end of the week. It was a move made from pressure rather than strategy, and he knew it when he made it. But the alternative was to call the regional vice president and tell him that an $80 million project had been stopped by a handwritten map and a 62-year-old piece of paper. And that was a call he was not prepared to make. The filing landed at the Sullivan County Courthouse on a Friday afternoon. Nora received the notice by certified mail on Saturday morning. She signed for it on the porch and opened it standing at the mailbox and read it in the morning light, with the sound of the sheep in the lower pasture behind her and the smell of the creek coming up from the western fence. The notice set a hearing date of October 28th. It cited the 1974 Natural Resource Development Act and argued that the Cobb Well, as an extraction point for a significant subsurface formation, fell under the Act's provisions for regulated development and that use of the well should be suspended pending review. She read it twice. Then she folded it once and carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table next to the ledger. Della came in from the back room and looked at the notice. She said, "What is it?" Nora told her. Della was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to call a lawyer?" Nora said she had looked into it and that a water rights attorney would cost between $3,000 and $8,000 for a hearing of this kind, and that she did not have $3,000. Della said, "What do you have?" Nora said she had the ledger and the certificate and the well records from the county clerk and the drilling report from Bud Meeker. She had the original application file, which she had requested from the state archives the previous month, and which had arrived in a brown envelope confirming that Emmett Cobb had filed the application himself without legal representation and that the state had approved it without condition. She said, "I have everything he used to get the certificate in the first place." Della looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather went to that office alone too, set it flat and without decoration, and went back to the back room." That same Saturday, Wade Renfro drove past the Cobb place twice. The first time he did not slow down. The second time he did. He sat in his truck at the end of the gravel drive with the engine running, looking at the lower pasture and the wellhead and the sheep moving across the field in the afternoon light. Then he put the truck in reverse and backed onto the county road and drove home. Nora did not see him. She was at the kitchen table with the ledger open and her notebook beside it and the hearing notice flat in front of her, writing out in the careful hand she used for things that mattered the sequence of documents she would need, the order she would present them, and the argument she was going to make to a judge in 4 weeks with no legal training and her grandfather's handwriting, and a piece of paper sealed behind beeswax that had been waiting 62 years for exactly this moment. She worked until the light failed. Then she fed the sheep and came back in and made supper and ate it across from Della. And the two of them did not speak through the meal, which meant, as silence between the Cobb women almost always meant, that both of them were thinking hard about the same thing and had decided separately that thinking was more useful than talking. Outside, the ridge was dark and the creek was running, and somewhere in the lower pasture, Lean was standing at the east gate looking up at the house, as though she had appointed herself to a duty that no one had assigned her and that she intended to carry out regardless. She worked at the kitchen table every night for the next 4 weeks. The ledger stayed open beside her notebook. The documents from the state archives stayed in a manila folder labeled in her grandfather's style, plainly and without decoration. She did not tell anyone outside the property what she was preparing. She fed the sheep in the mornings and checked the wellhead and walked the fence and came back to the table in the evenings and worked until she could not keep her eyes open. And then she went to bed and started again the next morning. Della watched all of this without comment. She brought coffee without being asked. She did not offer advice, and she did not ask how it was going, because asking how something is going implies it might be going badly. And Della Cobb did not traffic in implications of that kind. The 4 weeks passed the way hard weeks pass, which is slowly during them and quickly in the memory of them afterward. The morning of October 28th arrived cold and clear, the kind of morning the ridge produced in late autumn that made everything look sharper than it was, the tree lines precise against the sky, the gravel on the drive bright with frost that had not yet decided to melt. Nora dressed in the dark. She put on the brown canvas jacket she had worn to the livestock yard in May because it was the warmest thing she owned that was not a barn coat. And she took the manila folder from the kitchen table and the ledger from beside it and carried them both out to the car. Della was standing on the porch in her coat and her slippers, holding nothing, just standing. Nora said she would be back by mid-afternoon. Della said, "I know you will." Nora said, "If it goes wrong, I still have the settlement option. Agricor's lawyer mentioned it last week. They would pay to make this go away." Della looked at her for a moment. She said, "Your grandfather did not seal that certificate behind beeswax for 62 years so that we could take a settlement." Then she went back inside. Nora drove the 40 minutes to the Sullivan County Courthouse in the early light with the ledger on the passenger seat and the manila folder on top of it and the heater in the car running loud against the cold. The courthouse was a brick building from 1923 with tall windows and a parking lot that was half full when she arrived at 8:15. She sat in the car for a moment. She had been to this building once before, to look at the well records in the clerk's office, and she had found what she needed then by reading carefully and taking her time. She intended to do the same thing today. She went inside. Harlan Cross was already in the courtroom when she arrived. He had 4 people with him, 2 attorneys from the Nashville firm that Agricor retained for regional litigation, a paralegal with a rolling cart of materials, and a man Nora did not recognize, who sat in the row behind the attorneys and typed on a laptop throughout the proceedings. Harlan himself sat at the far end of the table in a jacket that was neither flashy nor inexpensive, and he looked at Nora when she came in the way a man looks at something he has been expecting and has prepared for. She set the ledger and the folder on the table on her side and sat down and did not look back at him. The judge was a woman named Patricia Holcomb, 61 years old, who had been on the Sullivan County bench for 14 years and had, according to the county clerk, Nora had spoken to briefly on a previous visit, a reputation for reading every document submitted to her court before the parties arrived to argue about them. She came in at 9 o'clock and sat and looked at both tables for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "I have read the filings from both parties. I would like to hear from Agricor first." The lead attorney for Agricor was a man named Fletcher, compact and precise, who stood and laid out the company's argument in 20 minutes of organized, technical language. The 1974 Natural Resource Development Act gave the county authority to regulate subsurface resource extraction on ridgeline properties where the resource had potential impact on the broader watershed. The Cobb Well, as an extraction point for a significant subsurface formation, fell within that regulatory framework. The company was not disputing ownership of the land. The company was asking the court to require a regulatory review of the water extraction before commercial use began, which was a standard and reasonable request under the applicable law. He sat down. The judge made a note. She looked at Nora and said, "Miss Cobb." Nora stood. She had written out what she intended to say on 3 pages of notebook paper, but she did not look at them. She had read them enough times that they were no longer on paper. They were somewhere behind her eyes. The 1974 Act applies to subsurface resources where no prior rights have been established, she said. Water Priority Rights Certificate Number 7, issued by the state of Tennessee on March 14, 1962, to Emmett Cobb, establishes prior rights to the subsurface water underlying the described parcel. The certificate predates the 1974 Act by 12 years. A right established before a regulatory framework exists cannot be retroactively subjected to that framework without specific legislative language authorizing the retroactive application. And the 1974 Act contains no such language. She opened the manila folder and placed the certificate on the table. Her grandfather applied for this certificate himself, using a standard state form. In 1961, she said, the state approved it without condition in March of 1962. It has never been transferred, never been challenged, and never been liened. It is on file with the Tennessee Division of Water Resources. She had the original, and she had a certified copy of the state archive record as confirmation. She placed the archive certification beside the certificate. She also had the original application file, showing the application was complete and correct in every particular, and the approval letter from the division director at the time, which contained no conditions or limitations on the rights granted. She placed those documents beside the others. The well drilled on this property on September 17th of this year by licensed driller Bud Meeker of Marshall County, Tennessee, is a domestic and agricultural use, well drawing on water covered by these prior rights. She said, "It is not a commercial extraction operation subject to new regulatory review. It is the exercise of a right that has existed for 62 years. She sat down. The judge looked at the documents on Nora's table for a moment. Then she looked at Fletcher and said, "Counsel, does Agricor dispute the validity of the 1962 certificate?" Fletcher stood. His client had not had the opportunity to fully evaluate the certificate prior to this hearing. He said, "The judge said the certificate was produced in discovery last week." Fletcher said his client had evaluated it to the extent possible in the available time and had questions about certain procedural aspects of the original application process. The judge said, "What procedural aspects?" The original application appeared to have been filed without legal representation and without a formal survey of the described parcel, Fletcher said, and there were questions about whether the application met the technical requirements of the 1961 regulations. The judge said, "Do you have the 1961 regulations before you?" Fletcher said he did. The judge said, "Please show me the requirement for legal representation in a water rights application under the 1961 regulations." There was a pause. Fletcher spoke quietly to the paralegal. The paralegal went through the materials on the cart. The pause continued. Fletcher said, "The specific requirement may not be enumerated in those terms." The judge said, "Please show me the requirement for a formal survey." Another pause. Longer. "The regulations as written appear to allow for a property description based on existing deed records," Fletcher said. The judge said, "And the Cobb application used the deed description." Nora said, "Yes, Your Honor. The deed description is in the application file. It matches the current deed exactly." The judge made another note. She looked at the documents on Nora's table for a long moment. Then she looked at both parties and said, "I am going to recess for 30 minutes. She left the bench. Harlan Cross leaned forward and said something quietly to Fletcher. Fletcher responded without turning around. The paralegal continued to go through materials on the cart with the focused urgency of someone looking for something that may not be there. The man with the laptop typed. Nora sat at her table and looked at the certificate in front of her and did not move. Caleb Briggs was in the hallway outside the courtroom. He had driven himself in his father's truck without telling anyone he was coming, because he was 17 and had decided that someone ought to be there and that someone was going to be him. When Nora came out during the recess, he was sitting on a wooden bench against the wall with his hands between his knees. He said, "How is it going?" She said, "I think it is going the right way." He said, "Do you want coffee?" She said, "Yes." He went and got it from a machine down the hall and came back and handed it to her, and they sat on the bench together and did not talk, which was the most useful thing anyone had done for her all morning. When the recess ended, she went back in. Judge Holcomb came back to the bench and looked at both tables and said she had reviewed the documents. The 1962 certificate was a validly issued water priority rights instrument under the applicable state law. She said, the 1974 Natural Resource Development Act did not contain language authorizing retroactive application to rights established prior to its enactment. The AgriCorps petition for a temporary restraining order on the use of the Cobb well was denied. The petition was not merely denied on procedural grounds, she said. It was denied because the legal theory underlying it was not supported by the statutory framework the petitioner cited. She looked at Fletcher when she said this and held the look for a moment before she looked back at her notes. The court finds that the Cobb well is a lawful exercise of prior established water rights and that no regulatory review under the 1974 Act is required or applicable, she said. Costs of the hearing were awarded to the respondent. She closed the folder in front of her and stood and left the bench. Fletcher was already speaking quietly to Harlan before the judge reached the door. Harlan listened with the stillness of a man processing information he had been prepared for and is now having confirmed. He did not look at Nora. The paralegal began loading materials back onto the cart. The man with the laptop closed it. Nora put the certificate and the other documents back in the manila folder and closed it. She picked up the ledger. She stood at the table for a moment and thought about her grandfather sitting at a kitchen table in 1961 with a state form and a pencil. And she thought about the word needed. And she thought about 62 years. And then she picked up her things and walked out of the courtroom. Caleb was in the hallway. He looked at her face and said, "Well," she said, "we won." He said, "All right then." He said it the way his father said things, plainly and without decoration. And it was exactly the right response. They walked out of the courthouse together into the cold October morning, and she stood on the steps for a moment in the sharp, clear air and looked at the parking lot and the street beyond it and the ridge visible in the distance above the roofline of the hardware store. The ridge was in full color, orange and yellow and the dark green of the hardwood stand, and it looked from this distance exactly like what it was, a piece of ground that had been holding something in trust for a very long time. She drove home. What happened in the following 2 weeks happened quickly, unusual for things in Sullivan County, where most significant developments preferred to move at the pace of the ground itself. AgriCorps' litigation team filed a notice of appeal with the state court on the 31st of October. The regional vice president called Harlan Cross that evening, and the conversation lasted 22 minutes, which Harlan would later describe to no one because there was no one he wanted to describe it to. The morning after the call, Harlan drove to the county assessor's office and requested the tax records on the Cobb parcel going back to 1990. He sat in his rental car in the assessor's parking lot and went through them for 45 minutes and then drove to the rented office above the hardware store and sat at the desk and looked out the window at the street below. The appeal would take months. The company's investment window closed in 60 days. The two facts were not compatible, and Harlan Cross, who had spent 20 years making incompatible facts compatible through the application of money and process, understood for the first time in this particular assignment that he had run out of both. He called the company's legal department and told them to prepare a settlement offer. The offer arrived by certified mail on the 7th of November. It was on AgriCorps letterhead and written in the language of institutions that wished to conclude matters without admitting the matters were ever in dispute. It proposed a payment of $60,000 to Nora Cobb in exchange for a release of any claims arising from the survey process and the subsequent litigation, with a mutual non-disparagement clause and a confidentiality provision covering the terms of the settlement. Nora read it at the kitchen table. Della sat across from her. When Nora finished, she set the letter down and said, $60,000. Della said, "What are their conditions?" Nora told her about the confidentiality clause and the non-disparagement agreement. Della was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They want you to be quiet about what happened." Nora said, "Yes." Della said, "What does Bud Meeker's report say the well yields?" The yield was strong enough to irrigate the full 68 acres and supply water to 2 neighboring properties as well. Nora said, Bud had told her informally that the commercial value of an agricultural water right with that yield in Sullivan County was difficult to estimate, but was almost certainly above $2 million if properly structured. Della said, and they are offering $60,000 to keep you quiet about a 62-year-old certificate that proves they have been trying to take this water for 30 years. Nora said, "That is about the size of it." Della said, "What does Wade Renfro know?" The question was unexpected. Nora looked at her grandmother and said, "What do you mean?" "Wade sold his 600 acres to Agricor last spring," Della said. She had heard from Ruth Gallagher's husband that Wade had been unhappy with the sale since summer. She did not know what Wade knew, but it seemed like a thing worth finding out. The next morning, Nora drove to Wade Renfro's property. She had never been there before. It was a drive of 4 miles on the county road and then a half-mile up a gravel track to a house that sat on a flat piece of ground at the base of the ridge with a view of the valley that must have taken a person's breath away in the morning light, which it did hers. Wade came out of the barn when he heard the car. He was in his work clothes and looked at her across the yard for a moment and then walked over without hurrying. She said, "Mr. Renfro." He said, "Miss Cobb." She said, "I am going to ask you something direct, and I would appreciate a direct answer." He said, "All right." She asked whether Agricor had told him what they wanted the land for when he sold it. Wade looked at her for a moment before he answered. They told him it was for a sustainable agriculture infrastructure project. He said, the word sustainable carrying the particular weight of a word someone else had chosen for him. They told him it would bring jobs to the county and that the project had full county commission support. She said, "Did they tell you about the water?" A long pause. A crow called somewhere in the tree line behind the barn. Wade looked at the ridge and then back at her. He said, "Not directly." She said, "What does not directly mean?" There had been a mention in the second meeting, he said, of subsurface resource value as a component of the overall project economics. He had asked what that meant and been told it referred to irrigation potential. The price they offered him had seemed high at the time, and he had not asked the question he probably should have asked, which was why they were willing to pay it. He had figured out the answer sometime around July. He said, when he drove past the Cobb place and saw the sheep grazing over the green patch in the lower pasture. He had lived on that ridge for 58 years. He knew what a seep looked like from the surface. He knew the Cobb place had one in the lower pasture because Emmett Cobb had told him so in 1974, the same year the Natural Resource Development Act passed. When the two of them had had a conversation about what the act might mean for ridge landowners, and Emmett had said he was not worried about it for reasons he did not fully explain. She said, "Did Agricor know about the 1962 certificate when they made you the offer?" He said, "I cannot prove it, but their geological consultant had surveyed the ridge corridor 2 years before they approached him, and the survey would have pulled the water rights records from the state, and the certificate was in those records." He said, "They knew." She said, "Will you say that in writing?" Wade looked at the ridge for a long moment, and then back at her with the expression of a man who has been arriving at a decision for several months and has finally reached it. He said he would say it in writing. He had already spoken to a lawyer in Johnson City the previous week about his options regarding misrepresentation in his own sale contract, he said, and his lawyer had told him the options were limited but not non-existent, and that documentation of a pattern of concealment across multiple transactions would strengthen his position considerably. He said, I should have asked the question in July, said it without self-pity and without expecting a response. She said, You are asking it now. He said, I suppose I am. She drove back to the Cobb place and called the legal aid office in Kingsport that she had called once before and been told they had a 6-week waiting list. This time, she said she had a documented water rights case with a successful hearing outcome and a potential pattern of fraud affecting multiple landowners and a corroborating witness prepared to give a written statement. The woman on the phone said she would have someone call back by end of day. Someone called back in 2 hours. The attorney's name was Sandra Alcott, 43 years old. She listened to the full account for 40 minutes without interrupting and asked 12 questions at the end, all of them specific and none of them wasted. The combination of the 1962 certificate, the hearing outcome, Wade Renfro's statement, and the timeline of Agricorp's geological surveys created a pattern a federal court would take seriously. She said, the relevant theory was fraudulent concealment of material information in a land purchase transaction. If Wade's statement confirmed what Nora had described, the damages calculation would be substantial. She said she would take the case on contingency. Nora said, What does that mean exactly? Sandra said it meant she would not be paid unless they prevailed, and that if they prevailed, her fee would come from the settlement or judgment. It also meant Nora should not sign Agricorp's confidentiality agreement under any circumstances, because signing it would foreclose the broader case. Nora looked at the settlement letter on the kitchen table. She said, I was not going to sign it. Sandra said, Good. She would file a preservation letter with Agricorp's counsel by the end of the week. After she hung up, Nora sat at the kitchen table for a while. The ledger was in front of her. She opened it to the inside back cover and read her grandfather's edition again. The dark ink on the aged paper, the words about Agricorp and the name they had used in 1987, and the certificate and the sentence about the water stopping them. She turned to entry 23 and looked at the place where the certificate had been sealed behind beeswax for 62 years. Della came and stood in the doorway and said, What did Sandra Alcott say? Nora looked up. She said, You know her. Della said, I know of her. Ruth Gallagher mentioned her name last spring when this all started. She said she had looked her up and had the number in her sewing basket in case Nora needed it. Nora looked at her grandmother for a moment. She said, You have been 3 steps ahead this whole time. Della said, Your grandfather was 6 steps ahead. I am only trying to keep up. Said it without irony, which made it more true. Then she said, What did Sandra say? Nora told her. When she finished, Della said, And Wade Renfro will give the statement. Nora said yes. Della nodded once. She said, Then eat your supper. The Agricorp case moved through the fall and into winter. Sandra Alcott filed the preservation letter on a Friday and received a response from Agricorp's Nashville counsel by Monday, which Sandra said told her a great deal about how seriously they were taking the matter. Wade Renfro gave his written statement to Sandra's office on the 12th of November, and Nora drove him there herself. They rode the 40 minutes to Kingsport mostly in silence, which was comfortable in the way that silence is comfortable between people who have arrived at an understanding without needing to discuss it at length. At the feed store, people had stopped predicting what would happen to the Cobb place. This was itself a significant development, because the feed store had been predicting the Cobb place's failure for 20 years, and the cessation of prediction represented a kind of collective acknowledgement that the ground had shifted in ways prediction could no longer track. Pete Gallagher mentioned once, in passing, that the well Bud Meeker had drilled was apparently something exceptional, that the water ran cold even in August, that Bud had said in 34 years he had not hit many like it. Nobody said anything about dead sheep. The Agricorp settlement offer, revised upward to $95,000 in the 3rd week of November, was declined by Sandra on Nora's behalf, with a letter that cited the pending federal matter and noted that confidentiality provisions were no longer a viable component of any settlement discussion. Agricorp's regional vice president called Harlan Cross on the 22nd of November. The call lasted 6 minutes. Harlan Cross left Sullivan County the following morning and did not return. The federal case took time, as federal cases do, but it proceeded with the forward momentum of a matter that has been well constructed from the beginning. In the spring of the following year, Agricorp's parent company entered into a negotiated resolution with the federal mediator that included a structured payment to Wade Renfro of $412,000, representing the difference between what Agricorp had paid and what his land was worth with full disclosure of the water resource, and a separate payment to the Cobb estate of $238,000 for damages arising from the fraudulent survey authorization and the costs of the subsequent litigation. A formal withdrawal of all claims to the Harlan Ridge water corridor was included in the resolution. The specific payment figures were covered by confidentiality provisions. The facts underlying the case were not, which was a distinction Sandra Alcott had insisted on and which Agricorp's counsel had eventually accepted. What was publicly known was that the Cobb parcel was no longer in default, and had not been since the 13th of November, when Nora had walked into Sullivan County Savings and Loan with a cashier's check and paid the outstanding balance of $54,000 and the accumulated interest. The teller who processed the payment had been at the livestock yard in May and remembered it, though she did not say so. She processed the payment, printed the receipt, and handed it across the counter. Nora took it, folded it once, put it in the manila folder with the other documents, and walked out. The ram that Doyle had brought from Claiborne County produced 41 lambs by March, and of those, 24 were healthy enough to sell. Nora sold them through Cora and through restaurants in Asheville and Greenville that had been calling since the previous spring. A chef drove up on a Saturday in March to choose his animals and walked the pasture with Nora for an hour, asking questions about the grass and the breed and the water source. When she told him about the well and the aquifer and the temperature of the water even in August, he stopped walking and looked at the wellhead in the lower pasture and said, "That is in the animals." She said yes. He chose 3 lambs, paid in cash, drove away with them, and called back the following week to say that the table had asked about the farm by name, which had not happened to him before with a lamb dish. The second well that Bud Meeker had offered to drill at cost went in at the end of April. It hit water at 66 feet, 3 feet shallower than the first, with a yield Bud said was slightly higher. He took his cap off again, which Nora had been told to expect and which still moved her when it happened. This large, practical man, standing in the mud with his hat in his hands, looking at the ground, the way people look at things that exceed what they had planned for. He said, "Your grandfather's map had this one marked too." She said she knew. He said, "How many more are there?" She said the ledger showed 7 total. Her grandmother believed Emmett had opened one, the house well, and left the rest for whoever came after. Bud looked at the ridge for a moment. He said, "If you ever want to find the others, I will drill them for cost. Not an offer, a decision already made, delivered for the record." She thanked him and he drove away, and she stood beside the new wellhead in the spring afternoon and thought about the word whoever. She thought about a man sitting at a kitchen table in 1961 with a state form and a pencil, thinking about a future he would not live to see, sealing a document behind beeswax, writing at the end of a page, "Do not open until needed," and meaning by needed not the moment of crisis, but the moment when someone was finally ready to do something with it. She thought that she was beginning to understand what he had meant. Wade Renfro came in June. He drove up the gravel drive on a Saturday morning and parked beside the barn and got out of his truck and stood with his hands in his pockets. And Nora came out of the barn with a feed bucket and stopped, and the two of them looked at each other across the yard. He said, "Morning." She said, "Morning." He looked past her at the lower pasture where the sheep were spread across the new growth before he spoke. He told her he had said it loud enough for a room full of men to hear, that she had thrown her money away on dead sheep, that he had been wrong about that, Nora said she knew. He looked at the ground. There were things between his family and the Cobbs that went back further than the auction. He said, and Emmett had used to say the ridge was worth more than what sat on top of it. And Wade had told him more than once he was a stubborn old fool who could not see what was in front of him. He said all of this without looking for absolution, which was why she did not offer any. She said he was right about the ridge. Wade said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, if you ever drill a third well and need a hand at the pump, or need a trailer for a livestock move, or need someone to stand at an auction ring and not bid against you, call me. She said, I will. He said, all right then. He walked back to his truck and got in and started the engine and drove down the gravel drive and turned onto the county road. She watched him go and then went back into the barn. Della was on the porch when Nora came up the hill in the late afternoon. She had the blanket across her knees and was looking at the lower pasture with the particular attention of someone watching something prove itself. She did not ask about Wade Renfro because she had seen his truck come and go from the porch and had drawn her own conclusions, which were as accurate as they always were. She said, the far pasture needs the fence checked along the north line. Nora said, I know. I will do it tomorrow. Della said, Doyle says the wool clip will be heavier this year. Nora said, Caleb thinks so too. Della said, that boy is going to know more about sheep than his father before the summer is out. Nora said, probably. They sat in the early evening quiet, the two of them on the porch in the cooling air, with the pasture below them and the ridge above and the sound of the creek coming up from the western fence line and the sheep moving in the long light the way they moved when the day was ending and they were settling toward the fold. Lean was at the east gate, standing patient and attentive, facing the house. Nora reached into her jacket pocket and took out the receipt from Sullivan County Savings and Loan, the one she had folded once and carried since November. She unfolded it and looked at it for a moment, and then folded it again and put it in the manila folder she had brought out with her without quite deciding to. Della said, what is that? Nora said, the receipt from the bank. Della said, put it in the ledger. That is where he kept things that mattered, set it flat and certain, and went back to her sewing before Nora had fully processed it. Nora went inside and opened the cedar chest and took out the ledger and opened it to the inside back cover, where her grandfather had written in dark ink about Agricor and the 1962 certificate and the sentence about the water stopping them again. She slid the bank receipt in beside the certificate and closed the cover and held the ledger for a moment, feeling the weight of 62 years of observation and preparation and patience that it contained. Then she put it back in the cedar chest, under the folded quilt, and went back out to the porch. The sun was behind the ridge now, and the pasture was going to that particular blue that comes before full dark in the Tennessee hills. The sheep were settling. The creek was running. Lean stood at the east gate and looked up at the house one more time, and then turned and walked back into the flock, and was indistinguishable from the others. Della picked up her sewing from the side table and worked in the failing light the way she had worked through everything, steadily and without comment and without any sign of stopping. And on the ridge above them, in the fractured limestone, 69 feet below the surface of the lower pasture, the water moved as it had moved for 10,000 years, cold and clean and indifferent to the affairs of the people above it, replenishing itself from the long, slow seep of the mountain, holding what it had always held, waiting, as it had always waited, to be needed.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time. The road